Welcome back, everybody. How do you have a Christmas special where only one half of the partnership is officially in Christmas and the other half is on the Orthodox calendar? Well, what you do is you hold it immediately after Christmas and you do a special about possibly state-sponsored, but maybe we'll get into that, terrorist organizations in the 2010s. That, to me, says Christmas. Kit Clarenberg, what to you says Christmas, and does it match the description I've just given?
I mean, precisely the same,
Yeah.
actually, and I think that like any consideration of Christmas on a personal or organizational level that doesn't reference potentially state managed terror is lacking.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Maybe,
very
yeah.
poor.
If you're not familiar with the work of art that we are referring to, of course, this is what we have mentioned before. Do it in our previous conversations, doing something along these lines, which is a review and analysis of the seminal. I think I'm using that word in a justified way. Chris Morris film from 2010. That's quite some time ago now. Entitled Four Lions, starring Riz Ahmed, who went on to have something of a Hollywood career afterwards. And this was the only really decent satirical treatment of the strange period in British and American history and Western history known as the War on Terror period, which produced all manner of utter shite, culturally speaking. You may be familiar with the works of Joel Surnow and 24, which acted as a sort of cultural preparation device for warming up the American public to fully embrace stuffing a petrol-soaked rag down a man's throat in order that it can be used as an implement of torture. That was one episode of 24 that I remember watching. This was in 2002. Other treatments of the War on Terror period.
I gather. I mean, I gather that Homeland, which was a similar, like CIA, Pentagon propaganda epic, like until relatively recently, they had similar scenes.
Yes,
with
it was 24 for Dummies, basically. It was 24, but you replace Kiefer Sutherland with Claire Danes. I've somehow merged Keir Starmer and Kiefer Sutherland there. That's a terrible.
Oh no! Don't give them ideas. Don't give them ideas because they will.
Keir Starmer, I think he would probably not be up to stuffing a petrol-soaked rag down somebody's throat. I think he would get somebody else to do it. The work experience guy at the CPS did that for him. But the point here is that treatment of this period, this very strange period, some might say a carefully curated period in British history, was largely of the propagandistic variety. And it was very rare that somebody actually came along and did what I will say, first of all, is both a serious treatment of the issue and, of course, an outrageously funny one at the same time. And maybe the only person that could actually do it is the man known as Chris Morris, who both Kit and I think it's fair to say, have been following with interest for quite some time, being both people who grew up in the 90s. Chris Morris was very much the man who was a very edgy satirist in a genuine sense of the term. And I first became familiar with his work. Oh God, when was it? Back on when I was watching The Day Today and not understanding any of the jokes, but thinking that
30 years ago now.
30 but it's fucking just like, years ago.
I would like to add, and I've noted to you in private conversations, dear Alex, that like I was living in southeast London when the 7/7 attacks occurred, which is to say, yes, 30 years ago, there was a slew of alleged terrorist bombings in across high-profile areas of London. I remember very well the state of lockdown that erupted from this, where like I would go to a tube station and I would be told by a police officer standing outside, oh, don't use the tube, it's too dangerous, right?
Yes.
And then in this wild summer, this kind of hot girl jihadist summer, you had on the 21st of July, you had comparable bombings to 7/7. You also had on the 22nd of July 2005 the shooting of Jean-Charles Menezes, who was this Brazilian electrician. And I was in Stockwell on the very same day that he got shot. I managed to make it into central London explicitly to access the HMV summer sale.
A man has to have his priorities straight, and this was
absolutely.
If you're in your 30s or early 40s, as I am, the HMV sales were a seminal event, and
legendary.
No terror attack, whether real or possibly state inventions, were going to get in the way.
No. I mean, no, nothing could stop us. I mean, really. And it's like, I mentioned this to you in private chat, like I believe it was the 22nd when Jean-Charles got shot. I met Chris Morris along with Charlie Brooker and who's the fat one from Little Britain? Matt
Lucas.
Yeah, Matt Lucas. Yeah, like I met them outside the HMV on Oxford Street, and I had a protracted conversation with Chris Morris in which I'm fairly sure he was spending most of the time making fun of me.
Sounds
such
likely.
as his such as his intellect as well. And he was talking about creating a project about terrorist groups. And so then we fast forward to the summer of 2010 when Four Lions dropped. Now I had forgotten how good this film was. I saw it in the summer of 2010. It was then put out for general release a couple of months later with a highly sardonic poster which noted that a vast number of mainstream publications had referred to it as funny. But yeah, that Four Lions, I think it really, and we are so far away from this right now, but it cut to the core of a long-standing number of concerns and anxieties and just general confusion around the fact that there had been these mass casualty terror attacks allegedly in the UK, and the Four Lions sought to identify how and why this had happened, and more generally skewer the war on terror and all of its ludicrous excesses. It was, I think it was and should remain a fairly significant cultural contribution to understanding this time. And as I said, I watched it on Western Christmas Day on the 25th of December, and I had forgotten how good it was.
Yes, and before we get into the meat of the issue, yes, because this I wanted just to say a little bit about Chris Morris's previous career, or his career leading up to that point. Started off doing recutting the speeches of people like George H.W. Bush when he worked at BBC Radio Bristol, I believe. He then went on to do a radio program called On the Hour, in which he collaborated with a man called Armando Iannucci, which is interesting that those two were ever in a partnership together, when Iannucci is now the absolute epitome of smug, very unfunny establishment so-called comedy, which he has been on a sort of trajectory towards for quite some time. Whereas Chris Morris has kind of done a bit of picking and choosing over his projects and has been quite careful about what he gets involved in. Iannucci just sort of degenerated into this, becoming this sort of just horrible British establishment liberal, to the point where he does like jokey podcasts with Alistair Campbell. But it's strange to think that those two were collaborators on the Hour, and they were collaborators on the Day to Day, not on Brass Eye as much, I don't think. But Morris was one of those guys who was guaranteed his work is a guaranteed media event for a long time, and he was quite legitimately loathed by a lot of establishment figures, because he had a tendency to actually be able to identify weak points in their narratives and then twist them to the point of absolute absurdity, in all of his works. And in this, I don't know whether you could say it's the peak of him doing that, but certainly like he takes it to a new level of the realization of what's been his career project. But what's your view on him then, Kit, as a satirist? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always thought that like Chris Morris was the kind of ne plus ultra, like of a satirist, because he went so much further than establishment pipe and slippers institutions like Have I Got News for You. Like he really, if you read what to my shame, when I was at college nearly 20 years ago, I studied media as that was one of my modules, and I was told by my lecturer at the time, if you want to understand like how news works and like how bad news reporting is, you watch the Day to Day, which is like, a fake news program which really savagely skewers the manner in which the media operates, and their thirst for stories, their thirst for war because they want stories, etc. So after Brass Eye, he kind of disappeared a bit from the public eye, apart from a project called Jam, which was this kind of dark comedy show that was broadcast on Channel 4 in 2000. Four Lions was his real first foray into making something a bit different, that was kind of long form and whatnot. There was a lot of expectation and speculation about what it might entail. Now, just from a personal perspective, and for whatever that's worth, which may be nothing, I was in my early teens when the bombings in London in July 2005 happened. I will never forget waking up to finding a welter of texts from friends of mine saying, "I've heard about all of these explosions in London. Are you okay?" I was in Stockwell on the day that John Charles Menezes, who was this Brazilian, this completely innocent Brazilian electrician, got killed by the police. I remember that summer very, very palpably as one of upheaval, of tension, of stress and anxiety. I would go to tube stations during this time, and there would be some designated police officer saying, "Well, it's not unsafe for you to use the tube, but you shouldn't do anyway because we don't know what might happen." Right?
Could it be described then, Kit, as a strategy of tension type scenario?
Yes, absolutely. And it's like, and I think that this entire, I remember having experiences where, I was sat on a bus, just traveling through Brixton, say, and then someone would ask, "Whose bag is this?" you know, like that was like the level of fear was, you know, people were pointing fingers at one another, and there was this wider sense that in any moment we could get killed in a in a terrorist attack. Now, I might add as well that, like, on a wider like on a wider level, Tony Blair, who was, you know, never one for shying away from opportunities to state Britain's imperial power, around the time of 7/7, he made a variety of bombastic statements about how, well, you know, our world has been upturned. It is our responsibility and duty to change change things accordingly. We must carry out transformation. You know, this is hugely significant. Blah 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 blah. And it's like, yeah. So I think that I can totally see why Chris Morris like wanted to skewer this particular period in British politics, and just more generally the alleged terror threat, which, you know, we don't hear much about today, but, you know, at the time, you know, it was like, you know, every day we are living on a knife edge. The next time you visit a store, the next time you get on a bus, the next time you get on a train, there is a very real prospect that you're going to be blown up. Like that. Well, that was the narrative. I remember
that was the narrative on the front cover of every newspaper. On, I mean, I remember. I don't know if you remember some of these. That I recalled when I was rewatching this. The plot to blow up Old Trafford football ground in it must be 2004, 2005.
Would you really miss it?
Well, I wouldn't personally, but you know, it's like if they wanted to do that, I think, you know, maybe some deal could be arranged. But this was like headline news for a good amount of time, as were several other big media events. And I think the two words to emphasize there are media events, because this is what a lot of this was when it comes down to it. Now, this is implied and hinted at in the film itself, as to, well, what exactly is going on with these supposed terror attacks? Who is actually really pulling the strings here? But what cannot be doubted now, because this has been established through various different reports since the 2000s, is that a lot of these guys were not just on the radar of the secret services, but in the case of them, something we've discussed before, which is the Manchester bombing, which came later in 2017. This guy was literally like an asset for the British Secret Service. His family was, and he wasn't atypical. Like, he was this is fairly standard for a lot of these guys to be, to use the media term, known to MI5 and MI6, and often they've been to. I think the last few guys who were arrested for like knife attacks have been to counter-extremism training courses that were their attendance at which was conditional upon for their release from jail. So it's funny how these guys all go to the same training courses and end up doing similar things. It's almost as if the counter-extremism courses they send them on produce the exact opposite result.
Yes. Oh, no. I mean, amazingly, yeah. I mean, as you know, and as we've discussed before, you know, anti-Taliban operations in Afghanistan benefiting ISIS. You know, anti-HTS efforts in Syria benefiting Syria. But I mean, I think again, there is like a wider point to make here, like, you know, as we head into discussion of this movie, which is that, that basically that in the wake of 9/11, and I mean, and the foundations were already there via the 2000 Terrorism Act and other bits of legislation, that there was this wider infrastructure which suggested there was this massive terror threat in the UK that authorities needed to deal with as a matter of utmost urgency. And then, but then, like when you break it down, like so many of, in respect of 7/7, say, you have a bizarre situation where the Home Office, according to its official narrative, and you can find this online today, these 4 bombers who told no one, including their families and wives, that they planned to attack London, made a lot of noise about their extremist beliefs, were reported to the police by multiple people because of what they were saying and doing, but they were still unknown to MI5. They acted almost to the extent of publishing what they were doing online, like without any real attempt to cover their tracks at all. And then it's like, well, we didn't see this coming. And that narrative of, well, this shows, and we've seen this over and over and over again ever since, this narrative that, well, the security services could have, should have, and indeed would have seen this coming if they had more money and power. It got very well entrenched after this incident, and it's like, and that has been the case, ever since. There was that bizarre in 2020. There was this bizarre report on purported Russian influence in the UK, which relied on expert witnesses such as Christopher Steele and our old pal Chris Donnelly, this insane anti-Russia hawk. And amidst all of the noise and the bluster, the conclusion was, well, MI5 and MI6 need more powers and money.
Always the answer.
Yeah. But like at this time, when this July 7th, 2005 attack happened, that narrative was kind of new. It's only recently that it's become, it's become like, rather mundane. Each and every time there is some kind of security breach, whether that's cyber or physical or whatnot, it's, the security services need more power. July 7th was the very start of that, like very palpably.
Yes, and this leads us neatly into the film itself, which is set predominantly in an area of the world that I'm somewhat familiar with, because it's sort of it's filmed, I believe, a lot of the exteriors are filmed around the Sheffield area, and of course the accents are all from the South Yorkshire area, and so familiar territory for me to a large extent, being from the other side of that county in northern Derbyshire originally, and so also
Alex, it's familiar to you because you've been to these training camps and you know that they are very real.
I'm not saying there are. I'm not saying there are training camps, but if they do exist, you would. If they didn't exist, you would need to invent them. And that's why I am modeling the look of Barry from the film today. Being
indistinguishable.
Now the film itself, again, takes place in Sheffield. It follows the activities of, in the end, 5, I think it's fair to say, mostly outrageously stupid individuals who actually, when you dive into the kind of people who actually do end up being arrested for these terror plots, they all seem about the same level of stupidity, bordering on retardation, both here and in the United States. They're led by the lead character, who's a little bit sharper, played by Riz Ahmed, and the ideologist of the group is the aforementioned Barry, who's like the white convert to Islam, who's actually based on a real guy. So I believe, who was a former BNP guy who read the Quran apparently and became convinced of its virtues and became like an enthusiastic Salafist shortly afterwards. And then you've got a bunch of other supporting characters in it as well. There's the other jihadists who are all various shades of dumb. Their nominal plan is to carry out some kind of action inside Britain, some kind of bombing. They can't agree on what they should do. But what becomes clear as we proceed through the film, and this relates to the discussion we've just been having, is that at each stage they are under surveillance and being followed everywhere they go.
Yes.
And the sort of the Barry character makes repeated references to we've got to beat surveillance, that kind of thing. But in reality, they are being tracked. Everything they do is photographed by persons unknown. And even right up to the point where at the end of the film, where the bombs are going off, they're being tracked. So it's a very, very interesting device that he uses there, Chris Morris, in sort of constructing this, in that he makes clear there is a hidden observer at all times in this, which the audience I watched it with missed it entirely. But I've thought about it since then, and it's obvious what he's saying there is that the security services are following at each stage. So these dummies aren't being clever at all. They're either being allowed to do this or they're being pushed forward. But I'll throw to you now, Kit, for your general impressions of the film before we get into a bit of detail.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things, and I've gone over a lot of the reviews from the time that this was released, and like one of the things that really like stands out is that like over and over and over again it is stated that Riz Ahmed's character, which is Omar, who is the reasonably smart kind of pinion in this, like he's the person pushing for this quartet or quintet to carry out attacks. I mean, they are like comically stupid, like to an extent that's like farcical. But the point is that as you say, from the very early stages of the movie, it is very clear that everything that they are doing is under the surveillance of MI5 or special branch, whoever that is. Now, you got to bear in mind, as we've said, this is based on the 7/7 bombings. Now, one of the key motivators of Riz Ahmed's character Omar is his wife, who is a nurse, who is reminds him, you were so much happier when you were going to blow yourself up, amongst other things. Now, there is a woman called Samantha Luthwaite, who has been referred in recent years by the media as the White Widow, who was the former wife of 7/7 bomber Jermaine Lindsay. Now, if you go back to early reviews of Four Lions, one of the common criticisms that is made is it's not clear why Omar, which is to say Riz Ahmed, wants to blow himself up. Now, his wife in the movie is quite clearly a very eager advocate of him doing that. Now, in reality, Samantha Luthwaite, who was the wife of Jermaine Lindsay, whose parents totally coincidentally happened to be involved in the British Army and were involved in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and the brutal crackdowns on Protestants there. She initially claimed following 7/7 to be completely ignorant of the fact that her husband was plotting to do this. And they met on the internet and all sorts of other bizarre, rather suspicious data points. Subsequent to this, Luthwaite joined extremist groups in Iraq and Syria, and also sub-Saharan Africa. And I wonder whether Chris Morris was, in framing Omar's wife in this as a key motivator, was referencing the fact that both Omar and his wife were working for the intelligence services. I mean, that's just my interpretation. I may very well be wrong, but it's quite an interesting it's quite an interesting feature that she's the one, like, and you've also got to bear in mind that, like, in the movie, Omar's family, including his brother, who is like this kind of devout Muslim, to the extent that that he and his fellow scholars force women to stay in windowless rooms while they talk about Islam. His brother is the one saying, you shouldn't do this. There is no Islamic justification for this. And he carries on going with his wife's encouragement. Now, as I say, Luthwaite has been built up. And if you can just Google her name and find multiple references to this, has been built up as this almost James Bond style villain. In terms of being an orchestrator and planner of Islamic fundamentalist attacks across West Asia and North Africa. And it's like, well, I mean, was this Chris Morris hinting that the people behind the 7/7 were being driven by an external force who also happened to have them under constant surveillance? Go ahead.
Just to dwell on that point there about his missus for a moment, because when you're making a film which comes in at around about the 2-hour mark, you have a limited amount of time. You have to make careful decisions about the characters that you keep from the original story and the original script. You have to be very choosy about what you put on screen, because then, of course, you need to cast an actor or actress. It comes with extra costs, etc. What you see on screen, especially from a filmmaker like Chris Morris, who was working on a limited budget, is all very deliberate choices. There's nothing accidental, and there's no what you would call fat in the film. There's no filler there. No. So what he's
it's impossibly lean. It's impossibly lean.
It's leaner than I was when I came back from 3 months in Laos. The point is that you don't make accidents in terms of the script choices that go into the final product there, the final cut of the film. So what you're saying now, I think, makes sense, because every conversation she has with him is designed towards steering him further down the path and making sure he remains on it. And apparently, like, the security services in the film are only interested in raiding the brother's house, the devout Muslim guy who, locks his wife in a cupboard. Whereas, like, the Omar's family are not portrayed as being like that at all. In fact, you would not even know really what religion they were most of the time, without the actual specific Quranic references that are periodically made. But as is the running joke in the film, most of the time he's talking to his kid about Disney movies, about like The Lion King and stuff like that. So it makes sense that the choice would be made to put the wife in there and have her play this key role. You're not having it specifically sort of crudely stated, but the role that she plays there is very clear.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that, like, there's an enormous amount of subtlety in the film which rather gets ignored by just like how brash and farcical like many aspects of it are. And it's like, yeah, that like there is that scene where where Omar and his wife are harassing his brother with water pistols and stuff, and it's just like, well, yeah, I mean, that wouldn't be in this kind of relatively low budget, and yes, very short movie if Chris Morris didn't want it there, right? So, like, we have to ask, why this was included. Now, I might add as well that Chris Morris undertook an enormous amount of research, talking to former wannabe extremist fighters throughout the region where this was filmed. There are a number of exchanges and kind of sections in the movie which seem very much intended and determined to drive the point home that.
All right. So, as we were saying, the no spare moments in a Chris Morris film. The choices that are made here are quite deliberate, and it implies, as you were saying, that the Morris had done a very serious amount of work regarding the background here, which is, as you were correctly saying, had spoken to people who'd been involved in these type of organizations, spoken to various different I think he spoke to some like coppers and ex-coppers as well, to build up a picture of like the kind of people who are involved in this. So again, there's no accidental choice here. It's the characters are all, again, there's writing for comedy in there, but also like they're informed by people who were very real and people who he'd got information on, and reflected also like the kind of people who'd blown themselves up or tried to blow themselves up in Britain, such as in 2005. So the progress through the film, then, to talk about that for a moment, we pick up with them trying to put their jihadist cell together in Yorkshire, with Riz Ahmed's character Omar, who we've talked about may well be some kind of state asset or another, or be under the control of the state. We've also got Barry, who, as I said earlier, the white convert, who is such an obvious, in retrospect, provocateur that, and of course was based on a real guy, an ex-BNP guy who read the Quran and apparently was convinced by it, so became an over-the-top Salafist. But just on Barry, he seems such an incredibly obvious provocateur, that, and again, it must be the case, in my view, that like that was based on the idea that he was being shoved into taking the provocative stances that he does throughout the film. What's your take on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think the thing with Barry that is very funny is that, like, he was based on an individual that Chris Morris met who was a hardcore, like, white supremacist, and then converted himself by accident to Islam by reading the Quran, so he could try and beat Muslims in arguments. But it's like, that there are a large number of parallels between Barry and a guy called Martin McDade. Now, this is like a quite extraordinary aspect of the 7/7 bombings. And my former collaborator Tom Secker, who runs spyculture.com, which tracks the influence of the Pentagon and the CIA on Hollywood, he had made a superb documentary called Crime and Prejudice about 7/7, and also wrote a book called Spy Secrets and 7/7. You can find them for free online. Now, one of the key aspects of the official narrative of 7/7 is that these individuals who were involved allegedly involved in blowing up tube trains and buses in central London. They had no Confederates. They had nobody in their wider social or personal circles knew that they were planning to do this. And there was no indication that anyone could have foreseen that they were plotting what they were plotting. This is despite ample indications that they were in contact with individuals within Pakistan. But also, more importantly, there was this former Royal Marine who converted to Islam, called Martin McDade, who was, this is like an ex-SAS, SBS, Special Boat Service operative, who was in direct contact with all 4 alleged bombers, and who ran what was called the Iqra bookshop in Northern England, which published pretty much without any qualification a wide variety of viciously anti-Western, anti-capitalist, anti-US empire texts, which pretty much openly called for jihad to be waged against the kuffar with all of their slags and their branches of boots that sell condoms that make you want to sleep with white women, as is noted in the movie. Now, his whole background is like super bizarre. He's been rather forgotten, and he has said, Martin McDade, in the to the extent that he was featured in the media, he admitted distributing DVDs that extolled jihad, but said, I can't understand why these people did this. So
not
yeah,
at all,
yeah. So it's like, I think that, like, I personally think that, and this particularly comes the case in Morris's kind of follow-up movie to this, which is called Day Will Come. I have largely forgotten it because it was so bad. And I think that this was, yes, The Day Shall Come, which is this kind of 2019 movie that was made by Chris Morris as a kind of as a sequel of sorts to Four Lions, and was likewise based on a very real FBI concocted terror plot. And I think that it was specifically dumbed down for American audiences by the producers involved. But I mean, that's by the by. But it's like, yeah, that, like, I think that Chris Morris with this movie was very subtly and not via any direct exposition, trying to heavily imply, if not state, that these bombers were being controlled by unseen forces for geopolitical reasons. Now, again, there is an element of incompetence there. There's that classic bit at the end of Four Lions where they are, because the 4 bombers are dressed in these costumes, like the honey bear of Sugar Puff's fame, and
a honey monster is not a bear.
Yeah. And it's just like, well, it is the target because I've shot it. And it's like, again, I would urge our viewers to go and check out this movie again, because it is very funny. It is very smart. As I say, I'd forgotten how good it is until I watched it on Western Christmas Day yesterday. But I think that he was making this very clear point that there is almost always in these plots some kind of security service influence, which tends to get rather lost in the informational quagmire once these things get started. 7/7 is a very, very bizarre case all round. As I say, Tom Secker has written an entire book on this, documenting the countless, innumerable inconsistencies, contradictions, oddities within the official narrative. He's produced an entire movie, kind of documentary movie about this called Crime and Prejudice. And it's like, the fundamental fact is that due to a variety of factors, there were and remain, a large number of individuals of Islamic background and Islamic converts throughout the UK, particularly in northern England, who, for a variety of reasons, harbour what many would consider legitimate grievances against the state. Now, in that context, when you do have this reserve army of people who are down on their luck, could be manipulated and bribed and conned into serving as the public faces unwittingly of major terrorist attacks and whatnot. That's worthy of further examination, and it's not happening.
Yeah, and never happens either. I mean, this is now 20 years almost since it's 19 years this year, 20 years in about a week's time since the year 2005, and a lot of this happened, the 7/7 attacks, etc. And there's been almost no examination by the bourgeois press of any of this. I mean, you got a little bit more when it came to the Manchester bomber, because his links to various activities of the intelligence services are so glaring and blatant that even the bourgeois press had to mention the fact that he got a ride back from Libya on a Royal Naval vessel, which is a strange thing for a guy who was apparently over there fighting a holy war. But
we've all done it. We've all done it.
Yeah, which of us hasn't missed his flight home, given a call to the Ministry of Defence, and said, "Hey, could you send us one of the few remaining functional British naval vessels over to pick me up?" But the interesting thing about this is, of course, the trajectory that they follow is they go to Pakistan, they go up to this training camp in what is assumed to be the Northwest Frontier Province or the border with Afghanistan, where a lot of this stuff has historically happened. And again, with various sort of slapstick consequences, but they are, of course, the two British guys are regarded by what are portrayed as the more serious jihadists in the group. They regard them as basically clowns, as
quote unquote fucking Mr. Beans.
Yes, which is how I believe I'm right in saying the British ISIS guys were regarded by some of the more serious characters in that operation who were doing actual fighting. They just used the clowns that turned up from Britain as essentially PR men, didn't they? To do videos that would be scary for a Western audience, and that was it. To whose benefit was it that they were doing those ISIS videos? That's a very interesting question, given that we know with at least one person who went over there who got demonized in the bourgeois press afterwards, which is Shamina Begum, was recruited directly by a Canadian intelligence asset and ended up as an ISIS bride.
Yes.
So
and it's and I think as well that this really does bear repeating is particularly in in the Syria context, say, my friend William Van Wagenen, that is actually his name, unbelievably, he's done some incredible work for the Cradle and the Libertarian Institute. He's really kept digging into the Syrian proxy war long after everyone kind of forgot about this. But he makes this point that if you look say James Foley, who was this US journalist who was writing all manner of rather awkward things from the US and British government's perspective about how the entire Syrian opposition was foreign and they weren't supported by local populations. he got kidnapped in like kind of 2012, 2013 for his reporting on Syria, and then in 2014 a video allegedly showing his beheading, or does it, gets released. And like, you got to bear in mind that, like, he was allegedly beheaded by this individual called Jihadi John, who was one of the quote unquote four Beatles, which is to say the British accented jihadist fighters allied with ISIS, who was tied to a variety of British intelligence infiltrated organizations in the UK, and then entered Syria on a rat line operated by the CIA and MI6. And it's like, well, ultimately, who was he working for, and upon whose orders was he operating? And it's like, there is so many layers of cutouts here that, like, you don't even know. And I think that is very much deliberate. It's by design.
Yeah, and the full reality of this, of course, isn't spelled out in the movie, but it's something that you and I have discussed on multiple occasions over the very many times now we've spoken, which is that the wheels within wheels here are significant, but there can be a line traced back to the security services in the West. I mean, your colleague Max Blumenthal did such incredibly valuable work writing something like The Management of Savagery, which showed quite clearly the very heavy investment that the White House, well, the entire American government and the British government were putting into running this dirty war in Syria. And if we look at the old maxim that war is the continuation of policy by other means, there is two policies that the war on terror period was principally serving. One was the invasion, occupation, and annexation, or attempted annexation, of countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, with a much longer list of countries to follow, which Syria, of course, amongst them. The other one is, of course, the attempt to use this to impose greater degrees of domestic control, which is very much plays into the Four Lions side of things, which is that the idea that the enemy is moving amongst you at all times. They are always here. They will strike at any moment. But of course, as he's made clear, like half these guys can't even tie up their own shoelaces a lot of the time.
Yes.
Never mind construct complex terror plots. I mean, if you think about the characters in here, we've covered Omar, we've covered Barry. You have the three other guys who have sort of varying degrees of utterly stupid, including Vaj, played by Kayvan Novak, who is a sort of long-time British comedy star. He is, like, of course, very, very funny, but like, he's actually pretty typical of the kind of guys who get caught up in this sort of kind of thing. Like, no real conception of the religion, literally, like, one of the ISIS guys, or was it? I don't know whether it was the ISIS guys or it was the 7-7 guys. I think it was the ISIS guys. Was caught with, like, the British guys were caught with, like, an Islam for Dummies book. Amazon list. And so, like, these aren't like guys who are particularly deep thinkers or particularly clever, but somehow they are supposed to be like these world threatening individuals. And the more a hidden hand, but the more you step back and look at it, the more you realize that this is essentially another version of G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday. Which is where you get to the inside of the circle of terrorists, and the inside is only a series of state agents. And so the other thing I wanted to discuss related to the film is as we go through, of course, Omar and Vaj fuck up the training camp in Pakistan in hilarious consequences, and it's sort of said that they decide to pursue their own target to basically make up for the fact that they don't have one. But is it our interpretation then, or your interpretation, that we actually think that they do have one and are actually being directed towards one, and that the whole network thing was always a bit of a farce, but we are sort of trying to interpret here what Morris was actually saying.
Yeah, like I mean, no, I mean that's precisely it, and it's just like, yeah, I mean, there is that kind of like tragedy farce aspect of when they go to the training camp. Barry's very unhappy about it and states that, like, well, I'm, still running the main unit here. And he does promise to not try and set up the Islamic State of Tinsley again as he's done before. But what's interesting is that they managed to, in attempting to shoot down a drone, kill their emir and and this welter of Arabs who are to be directing their mission. And they come back and say, well, we've got orders and we know what we're meant to hit and when. And it's like, well, either this is just arse covering because of their absolutely catastrophic, embarrassing failure, or there is an outside agency pushing them to do this. Right. And I think, it crops up again and again and again in the movie that Omar seems to have some kind of agency, which isn't just his wife, although she is an influence, pushing him to do this, and also pushing him to do something that is, at least in relative terms, something more professional than Barry's plan to blow up a mosque. Because these are all complete morons, despite the fact that Waj throughout the movie has that's Novak, excellently played, seems to have concerns about what he is doing. The only person within the group who seems to have like a real passion for carrying out a mass casualty terrorist attack is Barry. But then, and it is very clear throughout the movie that Omar Riz Ahmed has serious reservations about what they're doing, but feels that he still needs to do it, which is in itself, rather inexplicable and bizarre. So, yeah, I mean, again, I do think that in the spirit of these things, satirists, and I mean, they are descended from court jesters. There are limits on like what they can say and do, like in the context of their movies, particularly when, and I do think that there was some state support for Four Lions. I mean, it was, at least in part funded by Channel 4, which is a British government, funded
you cannot cheek the king too far in your jest.
And it's like, I mean, to use an example, like Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who was this very prolific German director, he made a movie called Third Generation in, I think it was 1978, and it's like it is a very bizarre watch. It's not particularly pleasant, but it is about terrorism in West Germany in the 1970s, which is often forgotten, was this huge phenomenon that killed a lot of people. And in the there are shades of Gladio in the plot, because this underground cell of disaffected students who form a terrorist group, they end up kidnapping this major industrialist who runs a variety of security firms and stands to profit from a quote unquote strategy of tension. And my reading of that movie, which I don't necessarily recommend people watch, because I mean it is a not particularly pleasant viewing experience with all sorts of industrial grinding noise and whatnot. But like my take from that movie was that Fassbinder was trying to nail Operation Gladio that we've discussed at length, but there were limits to what he could say and do. Like he knew like that there's a certain cutoff that like, well, I can't make it too obvious that this is a state operation to create a climate of fear and whatnot. But that seems to very much be the overarching narrative of the movie. And I think the same is true of Four Lions. Now, another aspect of this is that like when you have the denouement of Four Lions, where they are all dressed up in marathon costumes,
Fun run
and
gear.
fun run gear, where there's that immortal line from a police officer who said, "You're going to die in that gear, lads," and Omar responds, "It's all for a good cause, though." That like everything seems to come apart at that point. One of the characters decides that, like, to try and tell the police that, like, I'm not a bomber, I don't want to do this, and then he gets blown up by Barry remotely, and whatnot. And there is a lot of internal beef between the alleged bombers, and then the very last decision of Omar Riz Ahmed is to blow up Boots, as was discussed before, because they sell condoms that make you want to have sex with white slags and whatnot. I do think that like that Chris Morris was attempting to like really convey that, like, actually, when you strip away all of the ideology, the alleged ideology underpinning this, which Barry didn't really believe in quite clearly, that Brandon Novak didn't really believe in. He expresses doubts towards the end of the movie that what they're doing is right. And then you have the younger character who explicitly seeks to inform police about what they're doing before he's remotely blown up. It seems that there was this, that there was, like, again, the message tries to get across that these people are not really driven by any serious ideology. They were just blowing themselves up because reasons.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that actually does come across, like, like very strongly, that, like, well, this was completely pointless and they knew it, but they felt that they had to do it. Now, why did they feel they had to do it?
Well, that's the interesting question, isn't it? And one could speculate that perhaps one of the reasons why they felt they had to do it is various individuals kept pushing them towards it. Various organizations kept pushing them towards it. And just to say, the British state, we have talked about this before, but it's worth re-emphasizing. The British state, as many now have chronicled, including the journalist Mark Curtis in his book on the subject, has a long history of collaboration and employing the services of the most violent, reactionary, sectarian forms of Islam and its various different organizations, both overseas in areas where the British have sought to maintain, shall we say, a presence, and also domestically. Domestically, the two things got married up very much in the 1980s with the usage of these networks, partially coming from Britain, to recruit jihadists to go and fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And it was a lot of these guys who were involved with these networks in the 80s were the same guys who 20 years later were being arrested in that sort of war on terror period and being said, oh, these guys were running networks of jihadists out of London, including sending people to go to Afghanistan and Bosnia. It's like, yeah, I wonder how they were able to do that successfully for so long, when already in the 80s you had the building blocks of like police state stuff there with the Prevention of Terrorism Act. But we know that the reason why they got away with it was because these were campaigns that the British government was all in on. And the mere fact that they do have these long established ties, these very well developed networks into these organizations, and also the links with the Gulf states, which is where a lot of the money comes from, really you're not left with much of a doubt as to just how much the British state is invested in ensuring that this form of so-called radical Islam not only exists but continues to grow. And in that they are in partnership with these various different other entities, but they undoubtedly have an interest in its continuation. I don't have much doubt about that anymore. What do you reckon?
Well, no, not at all. And I think that, like, one of the I mean, this is something that I've written about extensively, is that, like, that Britain has a global, and this is a uniquely British strategy called CVE, which means it stands for Countering Violent Extremism, and like in effect, the purpose of this ostensibly is to to blunt and undermine the appeal of extremist groups and stuff, and they carry out CVE strategies, and they influence CVE strategies like across the world. Now, if you zoom in on Libya, which is was prior to Gaddafi becoming a Western asset of sorts during the war on terror. The Libya was home to an Al-Qaeda affiliated group called the Libya Islamic Fighting Group. Now, many of its members subsequently, when they were defeated by Gaddafi security forces, they set up shop in the UK. They were allowed to operate with impunity until the Gaddafi and British collaboration began, in which case they were members of LIFG, many of whom lived in Manchester, fittingly. They became subject to control orders, which were effective house arrest, so they had to stay at home for 16 plus hours a day. They had to wear electronic tags. They were their access to the internet and telephones even was limited. They were not allowed to talk to one another, and their passports confiscated. Now, when in the lead up to the Libyan civil war, this organization called Quilliam Foundation was employed by the British government to de-radicalize Libyan Islamic Fighting Group operatives, and this led in 2007, I believe, to the mass release of hundreds of LIFG fighters from prison in Libya, including its leaders. Now, you fast forward 4 years, and those same individuals are at the forefront of the Libyan civil war, trying to get rid of Gaddafi. There have been reports in Middle East Eye of some of these individuals being given explicit safe passage to Libya to do this, and being given phone numbers by the representatives of the security and intelligence services they were leaving, saying, if you get into any trouble leaving or re-entering the UK, give your border force interrogators these numbers, and we'll tell them that it's okay for you to do this. Now, again, in theory, these counter-violent extremism operations are meant to prevent such activity. So we must ask ourselves whether the ultimate objective of CVE projects is to construct the quote-unquote right kind of extremist sleeper army, which can be activated to stir up trouble and take down troublesome leaders as and when London requires. Right?
Yeah.
It's often. Sorry.
Witness Syria right now.
Yeah, and it's like we must bear in mind that Britain was a key organizing center for the Taliban when they were international pariahs during the 1990s. Their representatives were based in London. What a deadly web we weave when we practice to deceive. I think that the overall task of this movie, which was lost on a lot of people because they got kind of misdirected by how funny it was and how farcical it was, is that there are a large number of people within the UK who have been trained, funded, equipped, sponsored by the British state to carry out terrorist quote unquote attacks abroad, who can be activated to again, as we said, foment this strategy of tension at home as and when the context requires. Like, you know, I mean, it's been the best part of 10 years since we've heard about the threat of Islamic terrorism in the UK. Many people who were on MI5 radar and remain so are at liberty now in the UK. Why is that? You know?
Well, services to be required quite soon. I would also point out that this is the reason why you get preparatory articles, should we say, from the completely fraudulent journalistic industry known as national security specialists, and who write for the Telegraph, who write for Spiked magazine, and various other different, like, completely disgraceful like rags. Who will spend all of their time banging on about, like, the threat of Islamic jihadism, etc., in a way that's indistinguishable from the likes of Stephen Yaxley Lennon and others, who was also, I think, associated with the Quillam Foundation at one point, and maybe still is. And these characters are part of the game. These people priming the public for some kind of, like, resurgence of jihadism in Britain, and the tame, or supposedly tame, jihadists who are literally recruited for the British state and are sent to places like Syria and Libya to fight for it. Again, not even that controversial to say that anymore, really. Pretty comprehensively proven. These are all part of the same game. And if you go back and you look at the way that the British state has constructed its counterinsurgency machinery since the days of the attempt to suppress the peasant risings in Malaysia, when it was called Malaya, the same thing is in play. They've been developed over 70 years. And this is a version of it, the modern version of it. And I would say it's likely that a man as intelligent and as switched on as Chris Morris probably knows that, or at least knows quite a bit of it. And he's going, as you said, as far as he can in a movie that is ultimately paid for partially by the British state in portraying that. And how he portrays that is quite simple. He does it in implication, in subtly in some forms, but even just the act of having the characters photographed at various different points and making it clear that everywhere they go, they're being followed by somebody who it is never revealed who. And so by the end of the film, it is pretty damn clear what's going on if you're looking for it. And yeah, I'll just throw this in as the final point to you on this. At the end of the movie, he runs into, quite literally, like Riz Ahmed does, the guy who he works with at the security firm, played by the British actor Craig Parkinson, and says, "I'll level with you, Matt. I'm MI5." Now, that's in the film laughed at as a gag. And he gives this silly story about Fathers for Justice hooking up with the real IRA, and it's a nightmare scenario. But again, like, I don't know whether it's too on the nose to read it that way, or whether it's like a sort of slight admission there at the very end of the film as to what's really going on. But what's your take on that? Throwaway line or something more than that?
Well, yeah, I think that's it. It is very on the nose, and the way that it is presented is like, you know, a joke. But like it seems like pretty clear that, like, yeah, the point that Chris Morris was making was whether these people are fully aware of it or not, they were being influenced and pushed in particular directions by the security and intelligence services. And I mean, there's another point to make as well, which is when this is all over, Omar's brother, who is completely innocent and subscribes to a fundamentalist reading of Islam, as we've discussed, to the extent that women are kept in a windowless room while the men talk about scripture. He is then hauled in via extraordinary rendition to be tortured, and he's like rendered to this black site. There's all sorts of hilarity, which is very dark, where an MI5 or MI6 officer says, well, the second you entered this facility, you're now in Egypt, which means that we can now torture you with drills legally, and we know more than you think we do. But not only that, in the kind of final montage, there is that MP played by the guy who played Julius Nicholson in The Thick of It.
Alex McQueen is the actor's
yes,
name.
yeah. Who I actually saw him in central London many years ago, and I shouted to him, "These are good biscuits, and they cost £4," which is a reference to The Thick of It, which he seemed to find funny. But like he states on top of this ludicrousness about how the right man was shot but the wrong man was killed, he refers to how Omar had unknowingly killed Osama bin Laden when misfiring a rocket in Pakistan. And I think that, again, that is like, you got to bear in mind that when the Four Lions was released, the international hunt for bin Laden, which for a very long time was like, dominated news headlines. This seems like a kind of rather convenient way of dealing with this issue. And then we fast forward a year after the film was released, and Osama bin Laden was killed in very uncertain circumstances. It was filmed. Oh no, it wasn't. Obama was watching while SEAL Team 6 carried out his assassination. Oh no, they weren't. He was buried at sea in accordance with Islamic law, or was he? It deliberately, the film deliberately throws up a large number of questions which people should be asking themselves, because by the time that Four Lions was released, we were the US global war on terror, which was at the core of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and plans to overthrow all manner of Middle Eastern leaders, had rather died off and been forgotten about, despite the fact that it was such a hugely significant and dominant aspect in media reporting for so long. And so it was I take the kind of the final 10 minutes of the movie when Omar's not able to contact Waj to tell him to not blow himself up, and Waj is in Chicken Cottage taking selfies saying it's not my confused face and stuff. It's literally saying well, actually, in so many of these cases, we don't know. I've written about this extensively, but so much of the quote unquote intelligence upon which the war on terror was waged, it was based on testimony acquired via torture. It was based on scuttlebutt rumors heard from, the Iraq can strike Britain within 45 minutes with chemical weapons, which was the front page of many newspapers. This was provided offhandedly by an Iraqi taxi driver to an MI6 operative in Baghdad, and it's it's literally saying that we don't know, and out of this swirling what would you call it? Out of
vortex of bullshit.
Yes, absolutely. Spot on. Thank you. Yeah. It's almost as if I've been giving you pre-agreed lines, Alex.
Yeah,
that out of this kind of swirling vortex of bullshit, people are dying. Both innocent members of the public, but also people who are put up as sacrificial lambs to keep this narrative going. But actually, we have no idea what's going on, because our sole source for reality are officials who are themselves heavily implicated in extremely dubious and questionable machinations and connivances abroad. And I think that what's really interesting is they go to Pakistan, as we've discussed, to this training camp where alleged disasters occur, and they've been tracked by drones and all this other stuff, but they managed to get out. And it's like, well, even that, it's like, well, how? It's like, I think that Morris was here trying to sail as close to the wind as he possibly could in a very limited context, where you can't just come out and say this stuff is programmed, staged, whatnot. One of the earliest conversations in the movie that the plotters have, there is a when they are arguing quite angrily in this flat above a shop in Sheffield, it cuts to a camera angle outside, which is monitoring what people are saying and doing in this flat. And it's like, that to my mind is, well, Morris is showing that at that early stage, everything they're saying is being surveilled. Everything that they are doing is being very closely monitored.
Yeah. And as the argument we've been making builds towards, it's like, well, two scenarios then present themselves, which is and again, Morris was basing this off events that were taking place in the previous decade, including the London bombing and attempted bombings of 2005. Either they know everything, the security services, know everything that's going on and are following these guys every second of the day, including having sources or double agents or just flat out agents inside these groups, in which case, why on earth are these things not stopped? Is it a matter of extreme incompetence? Or is it the case that these are events which are curated and are delivered largely as the people who organize them, who really organize them or set them in motion, want them to be carried out? And given the history of the British state, its key role in the Gladio operations, I think it's fairly clear that it is these curated events are delivered largely as the instigators, the real instigators, want them to be. And as it was in the 70s, as it is in more modern times, with official enemies presented to the public that are in reality small groups that are very, very heavily penetrated by the security services, that are recruited, where recruitment is controlled by security service assets, which are deployed overseas on missions decided by people in London and Washington. And yet you're expected to believe that suddenly these guys decide off their own bat that, oh, you know what, we're going to bring the jihad right here. We're going to do it in London. We're going to do it wherever. We're going to do it in Manchester. And when you examine the whole history, then it just does their explanation of it, the official explanation of it, and the partial explanation make no sense. At all. It is the case that what you have here are events that are put together by those in power who have an agenda that they have been pursuing for decades now, not just going back 20 years, going back many, many decades. But I'll leave the final comment on the film and related events to you, Kit.
Well, no, thank you very much, Alex. You are. Say what you like about Alex. He is magnanimous. And we appreciate that. I think there's another point to make here as well, which is, it's rather circuitous, but what's really interesting is that Chris Morris and also Riz Ahmed, who excellently plays Omar, who we've discussed at some length, they both consulted Mozambique, who is this former Guantanamo Bay detainee, just because, not only for accuracy, but also because they were worried about, we don't want to offend British Muslims. That's not, our objective here. They sent it to him for review. Now, you fast forward to, I think it was 2014, and Begg gets arrested by British authorities for allegedly carrying out terrorist activities related to the Syrian civil war. And this was a huge trial which had an enormous amount of media coverage and interest. And in the end, the charges were withdrawn and he walked free, because it was acknowledged during his prosecution that MI5 and MI6 had known of, consented to, encouraged and facilitated his travel to Syria. Now, during Begg's trial, one of the key pieces of evidence that was testifying to Begg's alleged extremist proclivities was a witness statement authored by an academic whose name escapes you now irritatingly, who was subsequently charged with putting together a psychological profile of the alleged Manchester bomber, right? So it's like, I think that, like, again, in a roundabout way, and this is just speculation. I do think that concerns about offending Muslims aside, which is an important consideration, and I would certainly not, if I was personally to make a movie about Islamic extremism and terrorist attacks in the UK, I would absolutely not want to in any way offend or libel or malign Britain's sizable Muslim population. I think that they were sending this to someone who had seen the inside of covert British and American sponsored terrorist operations, to sit just to get their sign off to say, is what we are doing and saying here accurate, right? And Begg enthusiastically endorsed what they were doing. And this is someone who, has gone in the very classic manner of these things, from someone who was an asset to an enemy to a combatant to a Guantanamo detainee to a cutout used for operations in another theatre of proxy war to, again, a suspect who beat the charges because he was working for MI5 and MI6. So, I mean, I think that should tell you a lot about what Four Lions is actually about. Again, for people who haven't seen this movie or not watched it for a very long time, it is hilarious. It is savage. It is very, 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 very on the nose in ways which you probably couldn't get away with now. It's a must watch. Chris Morris is a genius. Enjoy, switch off, tune in, drop out, bear in mind that this is a snapshot of a now rather forgotten period in British and American history, where we were constantly told that Osama bin Laden and his Confederates were lurking behind every tree, which has now been forgotten. This period, and I think as well that, the last time that there were serious, like, kind of major mass casualty attempts or mass casualty attacks by alleged Islamic fundamentalist units, this was during the 2017 general election, when suddenly we had this, when Jeremy Corbyn was talking a big game about the necessity of speaking to our enemies as well as our friends, and the Conservatives were trying to make a lot of mileage out of the fact that Corbyn had previously spoken of Hamas as friends. That was the very last time. And during the election campaign, there was a welter of attacks and attempted attacks by, including London Bridge, of course, during the election campaign, and nothing's happened since. And we have to ask ourselves why that is.
Yes. What was it about the summer of 2017 that made all these guys decide that now was the time for the jihad? Makes you question all manner of things, especially when you look into the, as we've been saying, the background of some of these characters. But I will end by echoing Kit's words. Go and watch the movie. It is an excellent piece of work from a director who, as I said, picks and chooses his projects now. and is probably the last actual British satirist going. And Kit, thank you for joining me again today. It only remains for me to say to you, impossibly bad Serbian, Srećan Božić, which I believe is Merry Christmas.
Zdravo. Yeah, it's not it's not Christmas quite yet in Serbia. So,
but it will be
as
soon.
I mentioned. Yeah. As I mentioned on our last broadcast, I've done my my usual December 25th commemoration of eating Asian food and exploring abandoned Tito era buildings. It's been a blast. I hope that you guys have had a very good Christmas, and we will join you again next week. Decline and Fall continues to grow in strength and intensity. As I have said before, if you could please share, like, subscribe, comment, even just for the algorithm. Yeah, like, you know, we are under attack, we're being throttled, but it's great to see our audience growing week on week. So look forward to seeing you next week, where you know, given the pace of events in the world, I'm sure there'll be many more things to tackle and dissect. But God bless you, Alex. Take care.
Indeed, sir, and we will be back with you again very soon. Thank you for tuning in, everybody.
God bless, guys. Take care.